What do you want to see different in your life? You know, it occurs to me that every day we are faced with many, many things, with personal things that we want to change and make better and have be different. And of course, much larger things, political things that which are huge, and even larger political things around our ecological realities in this world today. So, how are we more effective in doing that? Well, I've got some ideas today and I've got some poetry. And it turns out that the first step is to not fight with reality. So that's my way of welcoming each of you here to Poetry, Passion, and Pleasure podcast. You know, this is where we work with poetry in traditional ways and also in non traditional ways to help us live a little bit more satisfying lives. Let's put it that way. So let's start with maybe a poem that is a poster child poem for the title of this episode, the essential subject of this episode, which is using radical acceptance as a way to be in the world. So let's start with a poem by the amazing poet Rumi. And this translation was done by Coleman Barks, who's an amazing, wonderful poet and translator in his own right, of course. This poem, the poster child poem for radical acceptance, is called The Guest House. And it goes like this. This being human is a guest house. Every morning, a new arrival. This being human is a guest house. Every morning, a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all. Welcome and entertain them all. Even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture, still treat each guest honorably. He may be cleaning you out for some new delight. He may be cleaning you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing. Meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. So we're talking about this topic of radical acceptance. And, you know, it occurs to me, as soon as we turn people and circumstances and things into enemies, into the enemy, we lose our best, most creative skills and capacities. And so, in other words, when something happens, you know, as Rumi says, when something shows up, a joy, a depression, a meanness, oftentimes our first reaction is to push it away, is to say no, is to refuse the reality of what is happening now. And paradoxically, what we're talking about here is that if we want to be the most effective at possibly making shifts and changes and differences in the world, it depends on us, again, paradoxically, being able to fully accept what has happened now in this moment. To fully accept what has occurred in our lives. And to be able to do that sets us up to be much more centered, much more calm, much more in our optimal zone, which is a wonderful way to think about this. And this is one of my friends and colleagues, Robert Gilman, at the Context Institute talks about this notion of how do we return to our optimal zone, because that's where, from that place, from that centered place, that's another word for it, from that centered place, we are going to be our most effective. And the thing that we want to have happen and change in the world is then going to be much more possible and much more likely to happen, actually. Now, one of the things that we can think about is that if we think about it, and again, here's another, radical idea, is when things happen to us and things that we absolutely do not want to occur in the world, either to us personally or things that we see at a meta level, at a large political level, or at an ecological level on planet Earth. How's that for a huge thing? Often, if we're able to step into it and accept that this is where we are, this has happened, this is reality, this is isness. If we're able to do that, now we are set to be able to shift and make changes much more skillfully. So let's move on to another poem by a poet who is relatively new for me, Persia Gertler. And it's a poem called The Healing Time. And I thought it kind of fit in our theme of radical acceptance. So here's the way the poem goes: The Healing Time. Finally, on my way to yes, finally, on my way to yes, I bump into all the places where I said no to my life. Finally, on my way to yes, I bump into all the places where I said no to my life. All the unintended wounds, the red and purple scars, those hieroglyphs of pain carved into my skin. My bones, those coded messages that send me down the wrong street again and again, where I find them, the old wounds, the old misdirections, and I lift them one by one, and I lift them one by one, close to my heart, and I say, holy, holy. Life serves up things, difficult things. And as the poet attributed to the poet Robert Frost, he said, the only way out is through. The only way out is through. So that oftentimes, if we're able to embrace the difficult, to step into the difficult with equanimity, to be able to do that, to have this radical acceptance, as we're saying, that paradoxically this allows us to put ourselves in that optimal zone, to put ourselves in that centered zone, to put ourselves in that calm and ready zone. You know, as I've mentioned on the podcast many times before, or a number of times before, I studied the martial art of Aikido for many years. And we would actually, of course, practice attacking each other so that we could, in a relatively, in a place that was safe, to the extent that we were sort of working with each other to increase our ability to deal with attack, to deal with difficulties. And so the idea on a 100 times, 200 times during a practice on any given night, you would have these attacks. And the idea was to keep perfect centeredness, or as perfect as you could, of course, to stay as centered and as calm and as together and as optimal as you could during the attack. Because what it meant to be able to do that, to be able to do that, the more centered we stayed, then the greater our ability to do the Aikido technique, which would then be successful. And the successful Aikido technique, as I've mentioned on this podcast, is one where no one gets hurt. Not the attacker, not the attacked. No one gets hurt. That is the magic. But it all depends on keeping balanced, even in the and even though we're practicing, it was real. It was not that it wasn't real. It was contained and it was safer. But the thing is that it was easy to have your intensity get up and your emotions to get up. But the idea was to stay as centered and calm as possible to be able to do the techniques. I was saying to myself, or the note I made for myself in prepping for today's podcast, is that saying no to or refusing reality, we become bogged down in a kind of grievance. And speaking of Aikido, and I've captured this line in a little piece that I wrote recently, the Yoshiba, the founder of Aikido, used to have this saying. He says, "He who has the mind to fight, he who has the mind to fight has already lost, has already lost. He who has the mind to fight has already lost." Yoshiba was talking about this very subject, the idea that as soon as we are kidnapped by our emotions, as soon as we are kidnapped by anger, by turning this situation into an enemy situation, as soon as that happens, we have now lost our ability to respond, and we are only reacting. We are simply reacting. And oftentimes we are at our most unskillful when we are reacting from a place of being kidnapped by anger, being kidnapped by emotion, being kidnapped by bitterness that this has happened to us. And again, as Robert Frost said, the only way out is through. So I actually was musing about this a little bit myself in thinking about this topic of radical acceptance, to be radically more effective in the world, put it that way. And I wrote a little piece that I called, just a short little piece called Fighting with Reality. Fighting with Reality. It goes like this. All our best futures will never happen, especially if we dwell there. Especially if we dwell there. So let's just stop for a moment there. So if we stay, the idea in mindfulness practice, and I think poetry is a perfect, tool for a life of poetry and a life of mindfulness, I think, go together. I should say it that way. But if I say all our best futures will never happen, especially if we dwell there. So mindfulness tells us that we spend so much of our time for mindfulness practice either in the future, worried about what's going to happen, or in the past, fretting about fearing what's happened, or feeling shame or guilt or anger or whatever. But either way, we're stuck and we are not available to now. And when we're not available to now, we are not creative. We are not effective. We just are not even there. We are in some movie of the past or some movie of the future. So I say, all our best futures will never happen, especially if we dwell there, stuck, dragging our feet such that history is forced to always linger, is forced always to linger. See, there's that two ends of it. Either stuck in the future or stuck in history. Neither one of those. Both of those are illusions, right? Of course, we plan for the future and we consider the past, but the only thing that is real this minute where we can be creative and effective is right now in this moment. So all our best futures will never happen, especially if we dwell there, stuck, dragging our feet such that history is forced always to linger, over and over, helplessly fused to the last thing that's happened. Kidnapped, where all the shining future is dulled by our refusals. He who has a mind to fight has already lost. Kidnapped, where all the shining future is dulled by our refusals. He who has the mind to fight has already lost. So, of course, I've appropriated the Aikido founder's famous quote that I just mentioned to you a few moments ago, Yushiba, that he who has a mind to fight, which, simply means it's a shortcut way of saying if we're stuck and we've entered this situation where we've turned the situation, the difficulty, whatever it is that impedes us, we've turned that into an enemy. And now we're ready to fight. And of course, everything is reduced. Our creativity, our ability to use our reasoning power, our emotional capacities, all of that is diminished. And of course, I'm not saying that there are emergency situations where adrenaline and all of that energy that comes through the fight or flight, it's not that that's not an adaptive thing to do in certain situations, but those situations are very far and few between. The situations where we are stuck in anger or stuck in an enemy mentality or stuck in a way of why me and how could this be happening and this is terrible. That's much more. Happens much more in our modern world, and that is what, as I say here in this piece, it helplessly fuses us to the last thing that's happened. Okay, so let's keep cooking. Again, remember our theme, radical acceptance, and we've added now radical acceptance for radical effectiveness in the world. And it's paradoxical because, it's anything, but sometimes people will say, well, if you're radically accepted, that means you're just passive. No, not at all. Not at all. It means that you want to be as centered and as effective as possible. And being able to accept what is, being able to accept the reality of now, puts us in a much more skillful position to actually change things going forward. Okay. I just have a couple of short pieces for us today. And one is called Everything is Going to Be All Right by the great poet Derek Mann, and Irish poet, amazing poet. Everything will be all right. And the poem goes like this. Don't forget the theme. How should I not be glad? How should I not be glad to contemplate the clouds clearing beyond the dormer window and the high tide reflected on the ceiling? There will be dying. There will be dying. But there is no need to go into that. The poems flow from the hand unbidden, and the hidden source is the watchful heart. The sun rises in spite of everything. The sun rises in spite of everything, and the far cities are beautiful and bright. I lie here in a riot of sunlight. I lie here in a riot of sunlight, watching the daybreak and the clouds flying. Everything, everything is going to be all right. Everything, everything is going to be all right. I lie here in a riot of sunlight, watching the daybreak and the clouds flying. Everything, everything is going to be all right. There is a kind of big yes to life, a big yes to life that allows us to take the smaller no stances when needed. We're saying yes to life writ large, large, so that we're able to understand and intuit and know by heart when it is time to work a small no into our lives. Radical acceptance is not, it's a way of developing a mindset. It's a way of developing a resilience that allows us to be at our best as we act in the world, to reinforce or change things in the world. Paradoxically, accepting what is allows us a much better opportunity to make skillful changes. As I said before, and I'm looking at one of the notes I made, it's not passivity, it's not anything goes, but it's rather a radical acceptance of what is, so that we can be in our most centered, most optimal zone for responding, not reacting. And of course, when we make that, we're making that distinction because a response is something that comes from our more centered, more creative, more optimal zone being, from our being in the world that way. And reacting is the kind of thing where it's just click whir. It's just boom, boom. And that is, we get into a very reactive mode when we turn what impedes us, as soon as we turn it into the enemy, then we are ripe for nothing but reactions, and often they are unskillful reactions. So I also wrote this one last little, just a few lines, a little piece, again, musing about this episode. I wrote something called Saying Yes to the Moment. Saying yes to the moment. It goes like this. Saying yes to this moment, saying yes to this moment will not prevent the wonderful things our centered and more powerful self may conspire to make real. Say that again. Saying yes to this moment will not prevent the wonderful things our centered and more powerful self may conspire to make real. If we fight the moment, the one called now, our best possible next may never be. If we fight the moment, the one called now, our best possible next may never be. And again, we're just another way to say the thing that we're talking about, because fighting this moment, turning whatever impedes us in this life, whether it's a person or a situation or a difficult political reality or a difficult reality regarding the Earth's ecology, climate, ocean, soil, habitat loss. We know all of those things which are rolling up into a great set of predicaments. And yet, for us to turn that situation into an enemy, to lose our best self, to lose our optimal self, to lose our center, he who has the mind to fight has already lost. To lose our center will do nothing but make us less effective, with less creativity, less capacity, less creative capacity to actually show up and do whatever it is we need to do to help and serve as best we can. The great philosopher Lao Tzu said, life is a series of natural and spontaneous changes. Don't resist them. That only creates sorrow. Let reality be reality. Let things flow naturally forward in whatever way they like. And in this way, we will be able to use whatever wisdom, how much ever wisdom we can muster, so that we can be in service to others, to the natural world, to the creatures we share this beautiful earth with, to all of it, to all of it. So that is a wrap for our episode on radical acceptance. We've just touched the surface here. There's so many poems that can help pickle us, that can help change our attitudinal stance in the world, so that as things come at us, we have ways to help ground ourselves, to center ourselves, to remember ourselves, to bring ourselves back to that optimal place, bring ourselves back, so that when we radically accept what is happening now, it will keep us from getting lost in the future, lost in the past, so that we can be effective and creative, the most effective and the most creative we can be now in this moment. In this moment. Okay, again, that's a wrap. Thank you so much for your listening here. If you've liked what you've heard, like the podcast, put a comment on there. However, whatever platform you're listening to this on, or if it's YouTube or one of the other podcast platforms. And also, I would love it and appreciate it so much if you'd pass this along or recommend it to someone who you think would appreciate this approach to poetry, this approach to using poetry as a foundational, fundamental tool in our everyday lives. Thank you again for listening. Until next time and next poem, well, please take care of yourself, and if you can, someone else.